Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and am a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are doing a folk tale. This one, like the episode from last week, is also a story from the southern Indian state of Karnataka. The variations of this tale have been heard in a neighboring state. This one is the adventure of a prince who just wanted to solve a massive pest problem in his kingdom. The only way to do that is that he had to go on a quest to get a special flower that only appeared when a princess in a faraway land laughed. The story also features a tree growing inside a giant's mouth when he was sleeping. So let's dive right in. The story starts with a kingdom in southern India that had back to back massive pest problems. The first one was indeed a standard pest problem with mice. Now, if the king had hired the Pied Piper of Hamelin, everything would have turned out differently. But he didn't, mainly because of the risk that the piper might kidnap all of the kingdom's children. So the king and his council tried something a little more creative. They introduced snakes. Everyone knows snakes are fond of mice. And the snakes loved it. To them, it was like being placed in an all-you-can-eat buffet. Things worked out really well, and people cheered on the king and thanked him for this stroke of genius. But that didn't last long. It started first with people finding snakes in their pantry instead of mice. Despite that, they were grateful for the pest problem the snakes had solved, and they just moved on. But soon, snakes were everywhere. People were finding them in their sinks, under the bed, in their hair. It was not an experience for the faint of heart. Things took a nastier turn when many of the snakes turned out to be venomous. The king and his council fired the herpetologist who had recommended all the species in the first place. But that was little consolation to people who were winding up in hospitals because of snakebite. The king suggested introducing an army of mongoose, but his own council voted him down. The king himself had to deal with the snakes in his own bed. He couldn't figure out a way, and his loss of sleep was not helping. He decided to go off into the forest, hoping for a quiet spot to nap in. He found a spot and commanded his soldiers to spread out and stand guard. He had also brought along his son. The king gave the prince a wooden sword and asked him to go practice somewhere. The king thought it was just his luck that he had to babysit this boy today. Maybe the king was being too condescending, because the prince's actions were going to save his life. No sooner did the king lie down at the foot of a large tree, he fell asleep. Suddenly, a very large and dark shape descended down the tree. It was the king of snakes. Fittingly, it wore a cute little crown to easily distinguish it from the other snakes. Oh, and just for extra measure, it had 7 heads. Each of the heads wore a little crown, indicating the snakes had a king who had 7 times the usual intellectual capacity of a regular snake. The 7 heads all descended down on the sleeping human king and poised to strike him, when suddenly the prince jumped in with his wooden pretend sword. "Ah, you wouldn't want to hurt a poor old snake king now, would you?" said the snake king. The prince was waving his sword and stabbing the air around the snake king, making it very nervous. The king continued snoring through all that. When the prince didn't stop, the snake king invoked the Geneva Convention. The prince was a bright lad, despite his father's rather low opinion of him. The prince got straight A's. He won every prize and was the teacher's pet of every teacher who taught at the school his father paid for. He knew the Geneva Convention because he had paid attention in class, and he promised not to harm the Snake King. He also introduced himself, Prince Rajkumar, which, translated from the local language, means Prince. The Snake King was called Nagraj. He was quick to point out how his name was not redundant, at which Rajkumar pointed to his sword to remind the Snake King who was in charge here. The prince suggested they talk terms. Nagraj said all he was trying to do was to get a glimpse of his human counterpart. He wasn't going to bite him. His snake people could learn a lot from this close encounter with the human king.
His snake people? Did he have tens of thousands of them?
The prince asked, suspiciously. Nagraj nodded.
So they are the ones infesting my kingdom and the palace too?
Rajkumar asked. The Snake King nodded again.
And you have the power to call them all off if you choose to?
Asked the prince. Nagraj shuffled his non-existent feet and said, "Well, about that, it's a little awkward, really. But I can't call them off. I'm supposed to be able to. I'm their king and they should listen to me. But I can't actually control them."
And why not? Asked Rajkumar.
It's just that I've been having these splitting headaches recently, and I can't sleep. It's disturbing my whole day, and I'm losing control. I can't manage controlling any of my snakes, not even the little ones.
Oh no, said Rajkumar. Have you seen a doctor?
Yes, I did, said Nagraj. He said the only way to cure my headache was to get a flower from the mouth of the princess who lives 7 kingdoms away.
Sounds like a quack to me,
the prince replied. Yeah, but it's medieval India, you know. What do you expect? Nagraj replied.
Have you tried a second opinion?
Rajkumar prodded. I did, and a third, and a fourth. But they were unanimous.
So why don't you do something about getting the flower then? Rajkumar asked.
I am doing something about it. I'm talking to you, Nagraj said. Me?
Rajkumar was genuinely surprised. How can I help you? And what's in it for me anyway?
A wife, potentially, Nagraj replied. The princess, whose name is Rajkumari, was voted the most eligible bachelorette by the royal magazine. And you yourself are a fine young bachelor. Her name is redundant too, because Rajkumari means princess, so she's really princess. So that should suit you just fine. And most importantly for you, if my headache goes away, I can control all of my snake people. I can take them all to Florida. I hear Disneyland is full of giant mice. Even though they might be wearing red shorts, they should still be edible.
Say nothing more, Rajkumar replied. You had me at wife.
With that, Rajkumar got general directions from the snake as to the location of Princess Rajkumari's kingdom and headed off in that direction immediately. It was a long walk across 7 kingdoms, and the rate at which he was going, it might take him weeks, if not months, to get there. The rate at which news travelled in those days meant that there was a real possibility that when Rajkumar got there, he would find that the Rajkumari had long married and had kids and even grandkids by now. But he hoped for the best and carried on. When he was hungry, he ate berries and roots he could find, and when he was thirsty, he found rivers and lakes. It was during one such pit stop at a lake that he noticed something. It was a bunch of ants in a little boat made of leaves. It was cute how the ants had named their leaf boat. They had called it the Titanic, which was reasonable considering how much larger the boat was compared to their little ant bodies. He stared at them with fascination and amusement until the boat capsized. All the little ants began panicking, and it looked like they might drown. Rajkumar decided that he must step in, even though he hadn't received an official SOS from them. He jumped into the water and made a mad dash for the site of the wreck. Quickly and carefully, he picked up each ant and placed it on his hands, and when he had collected them all, he waded back to the shore with them. The ants were so grateful, they didn't even bite him. They thanked him with their tiny little voices and promised to do him a good turn one day. All he had to do was to think of them, and they would show up. That puzzled Rajkumar, as he didn't think ants were telepathic. But they convinced him that they would somehow get the message. Didn't matter how. Rajkumar wished them luck with their next boat and moved on. A few days later, he came upon a very strange scene. There was a giant lying down in the middle of the forest. Apparently, he had been sleeping there after a hearty meal. A bird, flying overhead, had accidentally dropped a seed from a tamarind plant right into the sleeping giant's open mouth. In a very unscientific move, the seed had now become a full-size tamarind tree. When the giant woke up, he found that he couldn't even budge because of the weight of the tree. The best he could do is to make some gurgling noises around the tree that was growing out of his mouth. Rajkumar came up on the scene and realized this giant needed help. and the obvious way to help was to chop down the tree. So the prince got to work. The story doesn't explain what tool the prince used to do the job, but let's just assume that he borrowed it from the nearest Home Depot. It took several hours, but when he was done, the giant was able to get up and then simply spit out the stump and roots that remained. The giant thanked Rajkumar and said he could help Rajkumar as many times as necessary. All Rajkumar had to do was to think of him, and the giant would appear. Telepathy again? Wondered Rajkumar. But the giant wasn't sure either. He also wasn't sure when Rajkumar asked him if the giant would appear instantly or whether there would be a speed of light delay. The giant thought it was impossible to know, because in his frame of reference, he would appear instantly the moment he knew that Rajkumar thought of him. But maybe Rajkumar would perceive a delay. The giant suggested that they leave that for the physicists and assume it just worked by magic. Rajkumar thanked the giant and moved on. The rest of the journey was without incident. When he got to his destination, he was relieved to learn that Princess Rajkumari was still an eligible bachelorette, and there was a contest, the winner of which would win her hand in marriage. I had better try my best, thought Rajkumar. But also, it's a shame that she doesn't get to pick her husband, and a contest decides the winner. Rajkumar introduced himself to the king, Rajkumari's dad, and explained that he wanted to participate. The contest turned out to have no other contestants besides himself, because dozens of princes had tried and failed. It was soon clear to Rajkumar why. The king set 3 tasks for the prince. The first was to lock the prince in a giant room filled with thousands of sacks of something. The king explained that all the sacks contained a mixture of rice and grains. All that Rajkumar was expected to do was to separate everything into a rice pile and a grains pile. Why did you get them mixed in the first place? Asked Rajkumar. And how come there aren't any piles already? Did any of the contestants before me even attempt this task? No one attempted them, said the king. When they saw all the sacks, they gave up. As to why we got them mixed, we made a mistake. We ordered 1,000 sacks of the wrong product on Amazon home delivery. And now, Amazon is not accepting a return on these. Anyway, I suggest you get started. You have very little time if we have to get all this done by 7 in the morning. So, I have just 12 hours to do all this? Asked Rajkumar, shocked. Of course not, said the king. You have 11 hours. We switched to daylight savings time just last week. We haven't adjusted the clock in this room yet. With that, the king departed and left Rajkumar in despair. Despair soon changed to hope when Rajkumar thought of his friends, the ants. They instantly appeared before him. And what's more, they brought friends. A lot of friends. Rajkumar quickly explained the goal, and soon millions or maybe even billions of ants were tearing into the sacks and carrying grains into the 2 piles. When the king came by to check on progress the next morning, He was shocked to see that the job was done. Rajkumar left the details vague enough to avoid admitting that he hadn't done the job, but his insect friends had. The prince slept well that day and was prepared for the next big task. He was taken to another huge room, which had hundreds of huge containers of rice and buttermilk. His job was to eat it all by the next morning. Well, there was no controversy here. Rajkumar immediately thought of the giant, and he appeared. At a good time too, because the giant was hungry and ready to eat. He not only finished all the food, but poked around here and there, looking for desserts. He didn't find any, but went away anyway when Rajkumar urged him to. The prince didn't want his future in-laws or even his wife to know that he had had outside help. The third and final task the next day was to ring a massive bell the size of a mountain. The bell was huge and kept near the kingdom's borders. When rung, it could be heard across 7 kingdoms. The problem was, the bell was so heavy, no one could ring it. Again, it was the giant that Rajkumar thought of. Rajkumar went on his quest solo and found the bell. Again, it was the giant that he thought of. The giant appeared instantly, and he had no problem in ringing the bell. For him, it was very easy. He even asked if he could take the bell with him. Rajkumar thought that was an extremely good idea. That way, his father-in-law would not ever be able to ask him to ring it again. When the bell was heard back in Princess Rajkumari's kingdom, wedding preparations began almost immediately, which was great because now Rajkumar was in a hurry to get back to his own kingdom. But he had to sit patiently through the festivities. When those were done, Rajkumar and Rajkumari headed back. All this while, Rajkumar observed that the princess hadn't laughed at all. He was puzzled over that, but first decided to come clean with his side of the story. He told Rajkumari his whole story. The princess heard it patiently and then said, "You've been had." "What?" asked the prince, shocked. "Think about it, my dear husband. I have never had a flower fall from my mouth. I also don't recall laughing. But if it had happened when I was a baby, my parents would have mentioned that, don't you think?" Rajkumar said nothing. "Now think, what's Nagraj's real reason to send you on this quest? Do you think he really couldn't control his people? What if I told you that he only wanted to get you out of the scene? You, who are the only person to ever challenge or threaten him. What better way to destroy the kingdom than when its only sensible prince is away? And now that I think about it, I'm not sure you're all that sensible. Did you at least extract a promise from him not to harm the citizens while you were away?" "No," admitted Rajkumar. "I hadn't really thought of that." Rajkumari pointed out that had Rajkumar even stopped to think about Nagraj's story, he could have found all the flaws. She had one big piece of evidence that she must be right. 4 out of 4 doctors had provided an identical diagnosis of Nagraj's condition and its cure. 4 out of 4 doctors agreeing? How likely was it that it wasn't a made up story? Rajkumari would have been right, of course, in the real world. But this story is not in the real world. It's a folktale world with happy endings and a snake king who keeps his word and frees Rajkumar's kingdom from his coils in exchange for a flower. So, when Rajkumari laughed derisively at Rajkumar, 3 flowers did in fact fall out of her mouth. The middle one was the one Nagraj had asked for, so Rajkumar took it and gave it to Nagraj. Nagraj withdrew all his snakes after getting the flower and curing his headache. The people were happy with Rajkumar despite all the deaths that had happened in the months it had taken Rajkumar on his quest. The princess continued to laugh and supplied the kingdom with sweet-smelling flowers. That's all for this week. Some notes on the show. The idea of animals coming back to help accomplish seemingly impossible tasks is something we have encountered before. Though in today's story, it's unusual that the giant was summoned twice. I don't normally do back-to-back stories in the same category. I usually mix them up. But someone specifically requested this story, so I made an exception. Also, I know many of you have requested stories that I haven't gotten to yet. I ask for your continued patience as I go through my backlog of requests and balance different categories. If you think it will be helpful for me to set up some kind of a poll on the website so you can have visibility into the requests and vote on them, I would be happy to do that. Just let me know what you think by leaving a comment on the site sfipodcast.com or on Twitter or Facebook. That's all for now. In the next episode, we'll cover a Vikram and Betal episode that some of you have asked for. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.